March 17, 1944, 23,000 feet above Rabaul, New Britain. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh rolled his F4U Corsair into a near-vertical dive, the massive Pratt & Whitney engine howling as airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour. Below him, a formation of 6 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros circled at 15,000 feet, their pilots confident in the turning engagement developing with a flight of marine wildcats. Walsh's dive angle exceeded 60 degrees. His controls stiffened as airspeed pushed 420, then 440 miles per hour. The Corsair's inverted gull wings absorbed forces that would have torn conventional fighters apart. At 12,000 feet, still diving, Walsh opened fire. 650 caliber Browning machine guns converged their streams on the lead Zero. The Japanese pilot never saw the attack coming. By the time Walsh pulled out at 8,000 feet, 2 Zeros were falling into the jungle below, and the remaining 4 had scattered in panic. What Walsh had just demonstrated wasn't merely aggressive tactics. It represented a fundamental shift in Pacific air combat, the moment when American industrial engineering transformed theoretical performance into devastating tactical reality. For 3 years, Japanese pilots had dominated through superior maneuverability in horizontal combat. Now, American fighters were attacking from angles and speeds Japanese aircraft simply could not match. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how the Corsair's dive capability shredded Japanese tactical doctrine isn't just about aircraft performance specifications. It's about the collision between 2 fundamentally different philosophies of fighter design, and how that collision played out in the skies, where young men fought for survival at 500 feet per second. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero entered combat over China in the summer of 1940, and by Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviators had refined tactics around its extraordinary characteristics. The Zero could outturn virtually any fighter at speeds below 300 miles per hour. Its turning radius at combat speeds measured roughly 500 feet tighter than American fighters like the F4F Wildcat. In a traditional horizontal dogfight, the kind emphasized in pre-war training, a skilled Zero pilot could simply turn inside his opponent's circle and achieve firing position within seconds. This tactical dominance rested on design choices that seemed brilliant in 1939. The Zero's chief designer, Jiro Horikoshi, created an aircraft optimized for sustained turning combat. He eliminated every unnecessary pound, removed armor protection from the pilot and fuel tanks, used lightweight construction throughout the airframe. The result was a fighter with exceptional maneuverability but critical vulnerabilities that wouldn't become apparent until American pilots learned to exploit them. By early 1943, those vulnerabilities were becoming clear to American tacticians, but solutions remained elusive. The F4F Wildcat, flown by Navy and Marine pilots, could absorb more battle damage and had superior diving speed, but its rate of roll was sluggish. The P-40 Warhawk performed well in vertical maneuvers, but suffered at higher altitudes. The P-38 Lightning had twin engines and heavy firepower, but couldn't match the Zero in turning combat. Each American fighter had advantages, but none could defeat the Zero using conventional horizontal dogfighting tactics. Pilots were told to avoid turning engagements, maintain energy advantage, use superior firepower, sound advice, but combat rarely unfolded according to training manuals. Japanese pilots had been fighting since the late 1930s. They understood exactly how to force American fighters into situations where the Zero's turning ability became decisive. Into this tactical crisis arrived the chance-vought F4U Corsair, an aircraft that would change everything not because it could outturn the Zero, it couldn't, but because it rendered turning combat irrelevant through sheer performance in the vertical dimension. The Corsair's development began in 1938 when the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued specifications demanding a fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight. This requirement alone was revolutionary. At the time, most fighters struggled to reach 350 miles per hour. The Navy wanted not just speed but a complete package: low stalling speed for carrier operations, range of 1,000 miles, heavy armament, bomb-carrying capability. Chance Vaught's response was audacious. Chief designer Rex Beisel and his team decided to build their aircraft around the largest, most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double that of most contemporary fighters. To harness this power, they designed a massive 13-foot, 4-inch diameter propeller, the largest ever fitted to a single-engine fighter. The engineering challenge was immediate: how to provide ground clearance for such an enormous propeller while maintaining structural efficiency for carrier operations. The solution became Corsair's most distinctive feature. Rather than using conventional straight wings, Beisel's team created an inverted gull wing design. The wings angled downward from the fuselage before leveling out, creating a distinctive M shape when viewed from the front. This configuration allowed relatively short landing gear while providing propeller clearance. The prototype XF4U first flew on May 29, 1940, piloted by Lyman Bullard Jr. from the factory airfield in Stratford, Connecticut. On October 1, 1940, during testing between Stratford and Hartford, the prototype achieved 405 miles per hour with tailwind assistance, making headlines as the first single-engine American fighter to reach this milestone. The aircraft's actual maximum level flight speed was 378 miles per hour at 23,500 feet, exceptional performance for 1940. But the Corsair's true revolutionary characteristic wasn't its level flight speed. It was what happened when the pilot pointed the nose down. The Corsair's dive performance stemmed from multiple engineering factors working in concert. The massive R2800 engine weighed over 2,000 pounds, concentrating significant mass in the aircraft's nose. This weight distribution, combined with the Corsair's overall mass of nearly 9,000 pounds empty, 12,000 fully loaded, created substantial momentum once the aircraft entered a dive. More critically, the Corsair's wing structure could withstand forces that would destroy lighter fighters. The main wing spar was a massive aluminum alloy forging of exceptional strength. American metallurgy had produced components with load-bearing characteristics Japanese manufacturers struggled to match. This structural integrity meant Corsair pilots could dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour and pull out at G-forces that would cause structural failure in a Zero. The inverted gull wing design contributed aerodynamic benefits during high-speed dives. The configuration minimized drag and maintained control effectiveness at speeds where conventional wings might flutter or lose responsiveness. The Corsair's large control surfaces, ailerons, elevators, and rudder remained effective throughout the aircraft's speed envelope, giving pilots precise control even during aggressive maneuvers. Production Corsairs began reaching operational units in late 1942. Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-124 received the first combat-ready aircraft, deploying to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943. The Corsair's combat debut proved inauspicious. On February 14, 1943, during what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, American forces suffered severe losses. 9 American aircraft went down, including 2 Corsairs, while Japanese defenders lost only a single Zero. This disastrous engagement demonstrated that superior technology alone couldn't guarantee victory. Tactics mattered, experience mattered, proper deployment mattered. But over the following months, American pilots adapted. They learned that the Corsair's strengths lay not in horizontal dogfighting, but in what became known as boom and zoom tactics, diving attacks that exploited the aircraft's overwhelming advantages in speed and structural strength. The tactical evolution happened squadron by squadron, often informally. Experienced pilots returning from combat shared what worked and what got people killed. What emerged was a doctrine built around the Corsair's ability to control the vertical dimension of combat. The physics of dive combat were straightforward but unforgiving. An aircraft in a dive converts altitude into kinetic energy. Speed increases, momentum builds, and if the structure can handle the stress, the diving fighter becomes nearly unstoppable. The Corsair could achieve dive speeds the Zero couldn't match, and pull out from angles the Zero couldn't survive attempting. Major Gregory Boyington, commanding VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, refined these tactics throughout 1943. Boyington had flown with the American volunteer group in China before the war and understood Zero capabilities intimately. He taught his pilots to never, under any circumstances, attempt to turn with a Zero in horizontal combat. Instead, they would use altitude advantage to set up diving attacks. The ideal engagement profile became standardized. Corsair flights would patrol at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, maintaining altitude advantage over Japanese formations, typically flying between 15,000 and 20,000 feet. When contact was made, the Corsairs would position themselves up-sun, making visual detection difficult, then roll into steep dives targeting specific enemy aircraft. The dive angle typically exceeded 45 degrees, often approaching 60 degrees. Airspeed would build rapidly, 350 miles per hour at dive initiation, 400 miles per hour within seconds, 420, 440 as the Corsair plummeted toward its target. At these speeds, the Corsair covered roughly 650 feet per second. Japanese pilots had perhaps 3 to 4 seconds to react from the moment they spotted the diving Corsair to when it opened fire. That reaction time was wholly inadequate. Most never saw the attack until tracers began walking through their formation. The Corsair's 650 caliber Browning machine guns, synchronized to converge at 300 yards, created a cone of fire that could destroy a Zero with a 2-second burst. The critical phase came after the attack. As the Corsair flashed through the enemy formation at 400+ miles per hour, the pilot pulled back on the stick, converting speed into a climbing zoom. The Corsair's momentum carried it back to altitude, often higher than its starting point, while the Zeros below struggled to respond. If a Zero pilot attempted to follow the Corsair's climbing zoom, he faced impossible mathematics. The Zero's engine produced roughly 1,000 horsepower. The Corsair's R2800 generated over 2,000. The Corsair was faster in level flight, faster in the dive, and faster in the climb. The only regime where the Zero held advantage was sustained, turning combat, and Corsair pilots simply refused to fight in that regime. Japanese tactical response initially focused on trying to force American fighters into horizontal engagements. Zero pilots would act as bait, flying patterns designed to draw Corsairs into turning fights. But experienced American pilots recognized these traps. They maintained altitude discipline, refusing to descend unless conditions were optimal for a diving attack. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. For 3 years, they had owned the sky through superior maneuverability and pilot skill. Now American fighters attacked from angles they couldn't defend against, at speeds they couldn't match, then disappeared before effective response was possible. Lieutenant Junior Grade Kaneyoshi Muto, a Zero pilot with 16 victories flying from Rabaul in mid-1943, described the experience in post-war interviews. The Corsairs would appear above us, diving so steeply we thought they had lost control, but they were perfectly controlled. They would fire, and aircraft would fall. Then they would climb away faster than we could follow. We could not catch them. We could not escape them. We could only hope they missed. The structural limitations of the Zero became critically apparent when Japanese pilots attempted to match Corsair dive tactics. The Zero's airframe was stressed for positive G loads up to approximately 7 Gs in normal combat conditions. But the aircraft's lightweight construction provided reduced safety margins during high-speed maneuvers. Several documented incidents from mid-1943 involved Zero pilots attempting to follow Corsairs through aggressive dives, only to experience structural failure. The most common failure modes involved control surface flutter or wing failures at speeds above 380 miles per hour. The Zero simply wasn't designed for sustained high-speed flight. Its engineering priorities, extreme maneuverability and light weight, became fatal liabilities when American tactics shifted to the vertical dimension. By late 1943, the tactical situation in the Solomon Islands had fundamentally changed. Marine Corsair squadrons based at Munda, Vella La Vella, and Bougainville were achieving kill ratios approaching 10-1. The aircraft's combination of speed, firepower, structural strength, and proper tactics had made it devastatingly effective. Second Lieutenant Robert Hansen of VMF 215 exemplified the new breed of Corsair pilot. Between November 13, 1943, and February 3, 1944, Hansen shot down 25 Japanese aircraft in just 17 missions. His tactics were textbook boom and zoom: maintain altitude, identify targets, dive at maximum speed, fire short accurate bursts, zoom back to altitude, repeat. Hansen's combat reports, preserved in Marine Corps archives, describe engagements with clinical precision. On January 14, 1944, over New Ireland, he dove on a formation of zeros from 28,000 feet, achieved 430 miles per hour in the dive, destroyed 2 zeros in a single pass, then climbed back to 30,000 feet before the remaining Japanese pilots could organize a response. Total elapsed time for the engagement: 45 seconds. The mathematics of dive combat became refined through hundreds of engagements. Pilots learned that initiating a dive from 5,000 feet above the target provided optimal conditions. Too much altitude meant excessive dive time, during which the target might maneuver unpredictably. Too little altitude reduced speed advantage and limited escape options. The ideal dive angle was between 50 and 60 degrees. Steeper angles built speed faster but made aiming more difficult and increased stress on the airframe during pullout. Shallower angles were easier to control but didn't generate sufficient speed advantage over capable opponents. Opening fire range was typically 600 to 400 yards, closing to 200 yards. The Corsairs' 650 caliber guns were bore-sighted to converge at approximately 300 yards, creating maximum projectile density at that range. Experienced pilots learned to hold fire until reaching that convergence zone, then trigger short 2 to 3 second bursts. At a 450 miles per hour closure rate, 3 seconds of fire translated to roughly 2,000 rounds, striking a target area the size of a zero. The Zero's vulnerabilities under fire from heavy caliber weapons were catastrophic. The aircraft carried no armor protection. Fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Structural members were thin aluminum with minimal redundancy. A single 50 caliber projectile striking the fuel system could ignite the entire aircraft. Hits to the engine often caused immediate failure. The Zero's lightweight construction, which made it supremely maneuverable, also made it extremely fragile. Combat camera footage from Corsair gun cameras preserved dozens of these engagements. The film shows Corsairs diving nearly vertically, tracers streaming from wing-mounted guns, Zeros attempting evasive maneuvers that seem painfully inadequate against the speed of attack. In frame after frame, Zeros disintegrate under concentrated fire, wings separating, fuel tanks exploding, aircraft tumbling out of control. These weren't glorified dogfights with graceful maneuvering and tactical complexity. They were industrial-strength destruction. American engineering, mass production, and refined tactics meeting Japanese courage and skill with overwhelming kinetic force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By early 1944, the tactical revolution was complete across the Pacific theater. Corsair squadrons weren't just winning engagements, they were fundamentally reshaping how air combat was conducted. But understanding why required more than observing the results. It required examining the aircraft itself, measuring its capabilities, and confronting the engineering realities that created such overwhelming advantage. Japanese intelligence efforts to capture and analyze Allied aircraft had been ongoing since 1942. The Navy's Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal south of Tokyo specialized in technical examination of enemy equipment. Throughout the war, they had recovered examples of various American fighters from battlefields across the Pacific, Wildcats salvaged from Guadalcanal, P-38s recovered from New Guinea, damaged aircraft forced down on Japanese-held islands. But most captures were heavily damaged, bullet-riddled airframes or crash-salvaged wrecks that made determining original specifications difficult. An intact operational example of a frontline American fighter represented extraordinary intelligence value. In early 1945, that opportunity arrived when a Corsair ditched in waters off Japan's coast after engine failure during combat operations. Japanese patrol boats converged on the floating wreckage within hours. The pilot had ejected successfully, but the aircraft remained largely intact despite saltwater immersion. Recovery crews worked to prevent complete sinking, and the fighter was transported to Yokosuka's secure technical facility for examination. What followed was one of the most comprehensive technical analyses Japanese engineers would conduct on any American aircraft. Initial assessment focused on overall condition and structural integrity. Despite saltwater damage, the basic airframe remained sound. The massive Pratt & Whitney engine would require complete disassembly and cleaning, but the wing structure, fuselage, and control surfaces showed no combat damage. This was crucial. Previous Allied aircraft captures often involved heavily damaged machines where it was difficult to distinguish design features from battle damage. Yokosuka's technical personnel began with systematic photography and measurement. Every dimension was recorded with precision. Wingspan, 40 feet, 11.7 inches. Length, 33 feet, 4 inches. Height, 15 feet with wings extended. The inverted gull wing configuration immediately drew intense scrutiny. Japanese designers understood the aerodynamic advantages of this design: the reduced drag, the optimal angle of attack, the efficient landing gear geometry. But they also recognized its manufacturing complexity. Creating the compound curves and maintaining precise angles throughout production required sophisticated tooling and quality control beyond what most Japanese factories could achieve reliably by 1945. The war had degraded Japan's manufacturing capabilities. Skilled workers had been conscripted. Materials quality had declined. Factories operated under constant threat of B-29 raids. The Corsair represented what American industry could produce under optimal conditions, while Japanese engineers worked under conditions of increasing desperation. Disassembly of the wing structure revealed construction methods that technical personnel found both impressive and troubling. The main wing spar, the critical structural element carrying flight loads, was a massive aluminum alloy forging of exceptional quality. Its dimensions and load-bearing capacity exceeded anything in comparable Japanese fighters. Japanese engineers measured the spar's thickness, analyzed the alloy composition through spectrographic testing, and calculated stress tolerances. Their conclusions were sobering. This single component illustrated a fundamental difference in industrial capability. American metallurgy could produce large, complex forgings with consistent quality across thousands of aircraft. Japanese manufacturers increasingly relied on built-up structures, assembled from smaller components, a solution born of necessity but inferior in strength-to-weight ratio. The wing's internal structure demonstrated similar sophistication. Ribs stamped from aluminum sheet showed remarkable precision and consistency. Each rib was virtually identical to the next, indicating manufacturing processes with tight quality control. By contrast, Japanese aircraft production in 1945 showed increasing variations in component quality, individual aircraft differing noticeably from one another as factories struggled with material shortages and workforce depletion. Technical personnel turned their attention to the systems that made the Corsair effective as a combat platform. The armament installation was studied in detail. 6 Browning AN/M 250 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings represented formidable firepower. The installation was compact, reliable, and designed for ease of maintenance. Ammunition boxes, feed systems, spent cartridge ejection, and charging mechanisms were all engineered to work seamlessly together. The guns themselves were specimens of precision manufacturing. American ordnance production had achieved reliability levels Japanese industry envied. The Browning M2 machine gun was a mature design perfected through decades of development and manufactured by the millions with extraordinary consistency. Japanese technicians examining these weapons recognized manufacturing techniques and quality standards their own factories could not consistently achieve by war's end. Each gun could fire approximately 800 rounds per minute. With 6 guns synchronized, the Corsair could deliver nearly 5,000 projectiles per minute into a target area. The 50 caliber round carried substantially more kinetic energy than the 7.7 mm rounds used in Zero cowl guns. Even the Zero's wing-mounted 20 mm cannons, while powerful, carried limited ammunition and had slower rates of fire. The discovery of armor protection throughout the Corsair reinforced impressions of divergent design philosophies. 150 pounds of armor plate protected the cockpit. A 1.5-inch thick bulletproof glass panel sat behind the windscreen. Additional armor-protected vital systems, the oil cooler, fuel lines, and hydraulic components. Japanese fighters had largely abandoned heavy armor protection, prioritizing lightweight and maneuverability. The Zero's early success seemed to validate this approach, but as American fighters grew more powerful and better armed, lack of protection became fatal. Zero pilots in 1944 and 45 faced opponents with overwhelming firepower and no effective means of surviving hits. The Corsair demonstrated that proper engineering could incorporate substantial protective armor without sacrificing performance, made possible by the massive power of the R2800 engine. That engine dominated the technical examination. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp represented American aero engine development at its peak. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9, displacing 2,800 cubic inches and producing over 2,000 horsepower. Japanese engineers had encountered this engine before in captured aircraft, but never in sufficiently good condition for thorough analysis. Complete disassembly revealed manufacturing capabilities that seemed almost incomprehensible given Japan's industrial limitations. Cylinders were precisely machined with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Pistons, connecting rods, and crankshaft components showed surface finishes and dimensional accuracy that Japanese engine manufacturers struggled to achieve even in peacetime conditions. The 2-stage supercharger system, designed to maintain power at high altitudes, incorporated complex internal passages and precisely fitted rotating components. Japanese attempts to develop comparable supercharger systems had largely failed due to manufacturing limitations and materials science gaps. Without effective supercharging, Japanese engines lost power dramatically at altitudes above 20,000 feet, while the Corsair's engine maintained output to 30,000 feet and beyond. Perhaps most impressive was the engine's reliability. American radial engines routinely produced their rated horsepower for hundreds of hours between overhauls. Japanese engines, even new examples, often failed to achieve theoretical power ratings and required frequent maintenance. The R2800's consistent performance came from superior metallurgy, better lubricants, more precise manufacturing, and more sophisticated quality control, advantages that couldn't be replicated through design alone. The propeller system proved equally revealing. The Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller, with its 13-foot, 4-inch diameter and variable pitch capability, represented advanced aerodynamic design and hydraulic control systems. The propeller could adjust blade angle automatically based on flight conditions, optimizing thrust throughout the aircraft's performance envelope. Japanese engineers understood the theory, but lacked manufacturing facilities capable of producing large propellers with necessary precision and reliability. Examination of systems throughout the aircraft revealed consistent patterns. The hydraulic system operated landing gear, flaps, and other components with smooth, reliable action. The fuel system incorporated self-sealing tanks using multiple rubber compound layers that swelled when punctured, preventing catastrophic fuel loss. Japanese aircraft largely lacked this technology, making them vulnerable to fuel system damage that American fighters routinely survived. The electrical system powered extensive equipment through high-quality wiring with proper insulation and organization. The instrument panel presented comprehensive arrays of gauges, providing pilots with detailed information about aircraft status. Radio equipment was compact and reliable. Every system reflected engineering maturity and manufacturing quality. But the most profound revelation came from analyzing the Corsair's structural strength in context of its combat performance. Japanese intelligence officers had compiled combat reports describing Corsair dive attacks at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour. Some reports mentioned speeds approaching 480 miles per hour in near-vertical dives. These numbers had seemed exaggerated, possibly misidentified or measured incorrectly. Now, examining the actual airframe, engineers could calculate what forces the structure could withstand. The wing spar's load-bearing capacity, the fuselage frame strength, the control surface attachments, all indicated the aircraft could indeed survive such extreme maneuvers. More troublingly, the Corsair could pull out of these dives at G-forces that would cause structural failure in Japanese fighters. The Zero's airframe was stressed for positive G-loads up to approximately 7 Gs under ideal conditions. In practice, at high speeds, that limit decreased. The Corsair's structure could handle 8 to 9 Gs, and its heavier construction meant those loads could be sustained even at speeds where lighter aircraft would disintegrate. This explained the tactical dominance Japanese pilots reported. American fighters could dive faster, pull harder, and escape maneuvers that pursuing Zeros couldn't survive attempting. Technical personnel at Yokosuka compiled detailed reports documenting their findings. These reports, written in early 1945 as Japan faced imminent defeat, took on somber significance. They weren't intelligence gathering for future victories, but final reckonings with technological reality. One report, preserved in post-war American archives, included this assessment. The F4U Corsair represents integration of advanced engineering, precision manufacturing, and abundant resources. Its performance characteristics exceed our current capabilities across multiple parameters. The aircraft's structural strength allows combat maneuvers our fighters cannot match. The engine's power and reliability demonstrate metallurgical and manufacturing advantages we cannot replicate. The overall quality of construction reflects industrial capacity beyond our means to challenge. This was not defeatist propaganda. It was a professional assessment by engineers who understood exactly what they were examining and what it represented. The gap wasn't small or easily closed. It represented years of industrial development, massive investments in research and tooling, sophisticated supply chains, and resources Japan simply did not possess. By mid-1945, American Corsairs were operating over the Japanese home islands with near impunity. Navy carrier-based squadrons and marine units, operating from newly captured island bases, flew thousands of sorties, supporting the invasion of Okinawa and striking targets throughout the Japanese archipelago. The kill ratios had become almost incomprehensible. Corsair pilots were achieving 30-1, 40-1, even 50-1 victories against Japanese defenders. These numbers reflected not just the Corsair's technological superiority, but the complete collapse of Japanese aviation by war's end. Experienced pilots were gone, killed in 3 years of brutal attrition. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training, sometimes as little as 100 hours flight time before entering combat. They flew aircraft increasingly degraded by material shortages and manufacturing problems against opponents flying the most advanced fighters American industry could produce, piloted by veterans with hundreds of combat hours. The final months of the war saw Japanese aviation reduced to desperate measures. Kamikaze attacks represented acknowledgement that conventional tactics had failed. If Japanese pilots couldn't defeat American fighters in combat, they would simply crash into ships, trading one aircraft and pilot for maximum damage. Even these suicide attacks faced Corsairs in defensive roles, intercepting kamikaze formations before they reached fleet anchorages. Captain Kenneth Walsh, the pilot who had perfected boom and zoom tactics over Rabaul in 1943, flew combat missions over Okinawa in 1945. By war's end, he had achieved 21 confirmed victories, every one using the same fundamental approach: altitude advantage, diving attack at maximum speed, climb away before enemies could respond. Walsh received the Medal of Honor for his actions on August 15th and 30th, 1943, when he shot down 4 Zeros in a single day over Vella La Vella. Major Gregory Boyington, leading VMF 214, achieved 28 victories before being shot down over Rabaul in January 1944. He survived, spending the rest of the war as a prisoner. His squadron continued fighting, accumulating 97 total victories by war's end. The Black Sheep Squadron's tactics, refined through bitter experience, became standard doctrine throughout marine aviation. The Corsairs' combat record spoke to both the aircraft's capabilities and the tactics that exploited them. Official records credit Corsair pilots with 2,140 Japanese aircraft destroyed while losing only 189 Corsairs to enemy action during World War II. An 11-to-1 kill ratio, achieved across hundreds of thousands of flight hours in the war's most intense combat zones. These numbers reflected realities Japanese engineers discovered when examining the captured aircraft. Superior speed enabled American pilots to control engagement timing. Superior structural strength allowed maneuvers Japanese fighters couldn't match. Superior firepower meant brief firing opportunities could be decisive. Superior protection meant American pilots survived damage that would have killed opponents. Every advantage compounded, creating overwhelming tactical dominance. When American occupation forces arrived at Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal in September 1945, they found extensive evidence of Japanese technical intelligence efforts. Captured Allied aircraft were scattered around the facility in various states of disassembly. Technical reports, drawings, and photographs documented 3 years of attempts to understand Allied technology. American intelligence officers collected these materials, recognizing their value for understanding what Japan had learned. The reports on the Corsair, written in precise technical language, revealed the profound gap separating American and Japanese aviation by war's end. Japanese engineers had understood every advantage the Corsair possessed. They could measure it, calculate it, explain it in engineering terms. What they couldn't do was replicate it. The advantages came not from secret technologies, but from industrial capacity, manufacturing, sophistication, and resource abundance Japan couldn't match. The captured Corsair examined at Yokosuka has long since vanished, likely scrapped during the chaotic post-war period. But its legacy remains in the lessons it represented. When Japanese engineers measured that wing spar's strength, they were measuring the output of American steel mills. When they examined the engine's precision, they were examining the sophistication of American machine tools. When they calculated the aircraft's performance, they were calculating the power of an industrial economy that outproduced Japan by orders of magnitude. The Corsair went on to long service beyond World War II. It fought in Korea from 1950 to 1953, proving effective in ground attack roles even as jet fighters took over air superiority missions. Foreign air forces flew Corsairs in colonial conflicts through the 1960s. The last combat missions by Corsairs occurred in July 1969 during the brief soccer war between Honduras and El Salvador. On July 17, 1969, Honduran Captain Fernando Soto, flying an F4U shot down 3 Salvadoran aircraft, the final combat victories for the type. From its first flight in 1940 to final combat missions nearly 30 years later, the Corsair proved one of aviation history's most successful and long-lived fighter designs. But its most significant impact came in those crucial years from 1943 to 1945, when it fundamentally changed how air combat was conducted in the Pacific. The tactical evolution the Corsair enabled, boom and zoom attacks, vertical maneuvering, high-speed diving engagements, became foundational doctrine for fighter aviation. Modern fighter combat at its core still follows principles established when Marine pilots learned to dive their Corsairs at 450 miles per hour onto Japanese formations below. The technology has changed, jets instead of piston engines, missiles instead of machine guns, but the underlying concepts of energy management, vertical advantage, and speed dominance remain. For Japan, the encounter with the Corsair was part of a larger reckoning during American occupation. Japanese engineers and scientists who had struggled against material shortages during the war now worked with occupation authorities to rebuild Japanese industry. Lessons learned from examining American technology influenced post-war Japanese manufacturing philosophy. The emphasis on quality, precision manufacturing, and continuous improvement that characterizes modern Japanese industry has roots in the hard lessons learned when engineers examined what American factories could produce. The story ends not with triumph, but with acknowledgement. Japanese technical reports on the Corsair, discovered by American occupation forces and now resting in archives, serve as witnesses to a moment when one nation's engineers confronted another's capabilities. They had measured the performance gap, analyzed the manufacturing differences, calculated the resource disparities. Their reports documented these findings as acknowledgements of Japan's failed attempt to match American industrial might. The Corsair they examined represented more than a fighter aircraft. It was evidence of what technology, properly applied with adequate resources and sophisticated manufacturing, could achieve. It demonstrated that wars are won not just through courage and tactics, but through industrial capacity and engineering excellence. Japanese pilots had fought with extraordinary skill and courage, but skill and courage couldn't overcome the massive technological and industrial advantages their opponents possessed. In examining this American fighter, Japanese engineers confronted the full magnitude of the challenge Japan had faced from December 1941 onward. They had been fighting not just the American military but the entire American industrial system, the steel mills, the aircraft factories, the engine plants, the supply chains, the research laboratories. That system had produced the Corsair and thousands like it, each one representing capabilities that Japanese industry at its peak could not match. The lessons were written in aluminum alloys, precision forgings, and manufacturing tolerances that spoke louder than any words about the true nature of American industrial power. They were written in the combat records, the kill ratios, the tactical dominance that Corsair pilots achieved. Most importantly, they were written in the desperate technical reports compiled by Japanese engineers who understood exactly what they were seeing and what it meant. The technical examination of the Corsair at Yokosuka represented only one thread in a larger narrative that was unfolding across the Pacific in 1945. While engineers measured wing spars and analyzed engine components, American Corsair pilots were demonstrating daily what those measurements meant in actual combat. The dive tactics that had proven so devastatingly effective were being refined to even greater levels of precision and lethality. By March 1945, Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons operating from carriers and island bases had accumulated enough combat data to understand exactly what their aircraft could do. Pilots knew that a Corsair at 28,000 feet held approximately 8,000 feet of altitude advantage over typical Japanese combat air patrols. They knew that a 60-degree dive from that altitude would generate speeds exceeding 460 miles per hour within 12 seconds. They knew that at those speeds, they could cover the vertical distance to the target formation in roughly 25 seconds, leaving Japanese pilots almost no time to react effectively. The mathematics had been calculated, tested, and proven through hundreds of engagements. What had begun as desperate improvisation in 1943 had become systematic doctrine by war's end. Squadron-ready rooms displayed charts showing optimal dive angles, firing ranges, and pull-out altitudes. New pilots arriving in theatre received detailed briefings on energy management and vertical tactics before flying their first combat missions. Lieutenant Robert Wade, arriving at VMF 323 on Okinawa in April 1945, described the tactical indoctrination in his personal diary, and later donated to the National Museum of the Pacific War. They told us the Zero could turn inside us, could climb with us at low altitude, could outmaneuver us in horizontal combat. Then they told us none of that mattered. We owned the dive, we owned the zoom climb, we owned the speed advantage. Fight in the vertical dimension, and we would live. Fight in the horizontal dimension, and we would die. The choice was ours. Wade flew 37 combat missions over Okinawa and the Japanese home islands between April and August 1945. He achieved 6 confirmed victories, all using the same tactical approach his instructors had emphasized. Maintain altitude, identify targets, dive at maximum speed, fire accurately, zoom back to safety. He survived the war without suffering battle damage to his aircraft, a testament to tactics that minimized exposure to enemy fire. The Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945 showcased the Corsairs' versatility beyond pure fighter missions. While Corsairs continued to intercept Japanese aircraft with devastating effectiveness, they also flew thousands of close air support sorties. The aircraft's ability to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 5-inch rockets, combined with its structural strength and dive performance, made it exceptional for ground attack missions. Marine infantry, pinned down by Japanese defenders, learned to call for Corsair strikes with confidence that bordered on faith. The fighters would appear overhead, roll into near-vertical dives, release ordnance with remarkable accuracy, then pull out mere hundreds of feet above the battlefield. Japanese positions that had withstood artillery bombardment would simply cease to exist after Corsair attacks. Soldiers on the ground called them the Angels of Okinawa, a nickname that spread throughout the amphibious forces. The dive-bombing technique Corsair pilots employed leveraged the same characteristics that made the aircraft deadly in air combat. Diving at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour allowed minimal time for ground fire to track the aircraft. The steep angle meant the pilot could keep the target in sight throughout the attack run, adjusting aim until the moment of ordnance release. The Corsair's structural strength meant it could pull out of these attacks at altitudes that would have been suicidal in lighter aircraft. Captain William Snyder of VM F441 flew 64 ground attack missions during the Okinawa campaign. His combat reports, preserved in Marine Corps archives, detail the tactical evolution of dive bombing techniques. Early missions used 45-degree dive angles from 8,000 feet. By June, pilots were routinely diving at 60 to 70 degrees from 12,000 feet, releasing bombs at 2,000 feet, and pulling out with barely 1,000 feet of clearance. These extreme profiles were possible only because the Corsair could withstand the G-forces involved in such aggressive maneuvers. Pulling out from a near-vertical dive at 400 miles per hour generated forces approaching 8 Gs. The pilot's vision would grey at the edges, blood forced from the brain by acceleration. But the aircraft remained structurally sound, the wings taking loads that would have torn lighter fighters apart. Japanese defenders quickly learned to fear the distinctive sound of a Corsair in a power dive. The massive engine's roar, combined with air screaming past the inverted gull wings, created an unmistakable acoustic signature. Survivors of Okinawa ground combat, interviewed after the war, described the psychological impact. That sound meant death was falling from the sky at speeds we could not comprehend. There was no defense, no shelter adequate against their bombs delivered with such precision. The final months of the war saw Corsairs ranging across the Japanese home islands, striking airfields, factories, and transportation networks. The B-29 strategic bombing campaign received most historical attention, but Corsair fighter bombers flying from carriers and newly captured island bases contributed significantly to Japan's industrial collapse. They destroyed aircraft on the ground, demolished fuel storage facilities, and interrupted supply lines with devastating effectiveness. These missions involved the same dive tactics that had proven effective in air combat, now applied to ground targets. A flight of 4 Corsairs could approach a target at high altitude, roll into synchronized dives, deliver 8,000 pounds of ordnance with remarkable accuracy, and be climbing back to safety before defensive fire could organize an effective response. The speed and violence of these attacks left defenders with no time to react. By July 1945, Japanese aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. The few remaining aircraft were hoarded for kamikaze missions, their pilots barely trained, their machines often mechanically unsound. When they did launch attacks against American naval forces, they faced Corsairs flying combat air patrol, intercepting them long before they could reach their targets. The disparity had become absolute. Japanese pilots with 100 hours of training flying degraded aircraft faced American pilots with 500 hours of training flying the most advanced fighters available. The outcomes were predetermined. Combat Air Patrol reports from July and August 1945 read like target practice scores. 4 bandits intercepted, 4 splashed. 6 hostiles engaged, 6 destroyed. The numbers reflected not combat but execution. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. Between these events, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over. In the immediate aftermath, American forces began occupying Japan. When intelligence officers reached Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal in September, they discovered the full extent of Japanese technical analysis efforts. The captured Corsair sat in a hangar, partially disassembled, surrounded by measuring equipment and technical documentation. The aircraft had been studied with remarkable thoroughness, every component examined, every system analyzed. American engineers reviewing the Japanese reports found them impressively professional. The measurements were accurate, the analysis sound, the conclusions honest. Japanese engineers had understood exactly what they were examining and what it represented. Their reports contained no wishful thinking, no propaganda about Japanese technological superiority. They simply documented the reality of American industrial and engineering advantages. One report, translated and filed with U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey documents, included this passage. The F4U Corsair demonstrates integration of advanced manufacturing techniques with sophisticated engineering design. The aircraft represents not a single technological breakthrough, but rather systematic excellence across all parameters. We cannot replicate these capabilities with current industrial resources. The gap represents not months but years of development, assuming access to materials and facilities we do not possess. This acknowledgement carried profound implications. Japanese engineers were admitting their nation had been fighting an opponent whose industrial capacity they could not match. The Corsair was merely one example, one aircraft among thousands that demonstrated the same pattern. American industry could produce complex machinery with consistent quality at scales Japan could never achieve. The post-war period saw dramatic changes in Japanese aviation. The occupation authorities dismantled Japan's military aviation industry, prohibiting aircraft development and production. Engineers who had designed Zeros and other fighters found themselves working in unrelated fields or emigrating. The knowledge they had accumulated, including lessons learned from examining the Corsair, seemed destined for irrelevance. But in the 1950s, as the occupation ended and Japan began rebuilding its industry, those lessons resurfaced. Japanese manufacturing philosophy increasingly emphasized quality control, precision manufacturing, and continuous improvement. These principles had roots in the wartime experience, in the bitter knowledge of what happened when manufacturing quality was inadequate against better-equipped opponents. The Corsair itself remained in American service well into the jet age. In Korea, from 1950 to 53, Corsairs flew primarily ground attack missions. Jets like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-86 Sabre handled air superiority, but Corsairs proved ideal for close air support. Their ability to carry heavy ordnance loads, loiter over battlefields, and deliver weapons with precision made them valuable, despite being technologically obsolete compared to jets. Marine aviators who had flown Corsairs against Japanese targets in World War II found themselves flying the same aircraft type against North Korean and Chinese forces. The tactics remained largely unchanged. Dive at maximum speed, deliver ordnance accurately, pull out aggressively, return to base. The Corsair's structural strength and power that had made it deadly against Zeros proved equally effective against ground targets in a different war. The final chapter of the Corsair's combat service came in the 1960s, when several nations still operated the type. France flew Corsairs in Algeria and Indochina. Honduras and El Salvador both operated Corsairs, which led to the aircraft's last combat action during their brief 1969 conflict. When Honduran Captain Fernando Soto shot down 3 Salvadoran aircraft on July 17, 1969, including 2 Corsairs, he achieved the final aerial victories for an aircraft type whose combat career had spanned nearly 30 years. The story of the Corsairs' dive tactics and their impact on Pacific air combat represents more than military history. It illustrates how engineering excellence, when combined with proper tactical doctrine and adequate training, creates decisive advantages. The Corsair wasn't invincible. 189 were lost to enemy action during World War II, but it was overwhelmingly superior when employed correctly, and American pilots learned to employ it very correctly indeed. For Japan, the Corsair symbolized everything they had been fighting against: the industrial capacity, the technological sophistication, the resource abundance. Japanese engineers examining the captured aircraft understood this completely. They measured the evidence of American superiority in precise dimensions, in alloy compositions, in manufacturing tolerances. Their reports documented not just an aircraft but a system, an entire industrial economy optimized for war production. The lessons taught by that examination influenced Japanese thinking for decades afterward. When Japanese industry was rebuilt in the post-war era, it incorporated principles learned from studying what American manufacturing could achieve. The emphasis on quality, the attention to detail, the pursuit of excellence across all parameters, these became hallmarks of Japanese industrial philosophy. They had learned what happened when quality was insufficient against better-equipped opponents. They never forgot. The Corsair that Japanese engineers examined at Yokosuka in early 1945 has vanished into history. But its legacy remains in the tactical doctrines it inspired, in the combat records it established, and in the lessons it taught about the decisive importance of industrial capability in modern warfare. Those lessons were written in the aircraft's structure, in the reports Japanese engineers compiled, and most definitively in the skies over the Pacific, where Corsair pilots dove at 450 miles per hour and shredded zeros in seconds. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.